for the rest of it.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. So that's why he signed you.
Oh, that's nice.
So he did that. He did my two things, which was
Yeah,
really nice.
that was where I wrote him a letter.
Yeah, and he sent me that.
The Rower series. I have to admit, I've been looking forward to this evening. For the inside track on the Reverend Audrey by Veronica Chambers, his daughter. And it's wonderful to have members of the Audrey family here as we celebrate this fantastic anniversary. Having spoken to so many people today, the one thing I can say is the thing that many of you know, how many hearts and lives have been touched by these wonderful stories. So, over to you, Veronica. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us tonight.
Can we give her a round of applause?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here tonight. And a huge thank you to all the people who've been involved in organising this. Jane Chamberlain initially, setting things up, and we corresponded a lot, but then things have passed on to other people, and it's been a lovely day today, and in fact it was a lovely evening yesterday too. So if you've been here part of the time or all of the time, thank you very much. Important people here, my husband Richard, who does all the pictures, and my son-in-law Ian, who has helped us out of a huge hole in technology, so thank you very much for that. Right, we sum up. This is a picture from the front of the Observer magazine in 1979, I believe, and that is a very typical picture. Those of you who might have met my father here in Rodborough will agree that that was very much what he looked like. And this one was a much more formal one, probably taken specifically for publicity purposes. And looking much younger, the hair not quite so long. As Peter said, I'm Veronica, middle child of Wilbert and Margaret. My brother Christopher is older than me. He's the one in the middle and doesn't travel very much. My sister Hilary, on the right-hand side, was younger than me and very sadly died in 2013. Otherwise, she'd have been very much part of this too. So that was taken in 1951, so we're considerably younger than we are now. You might wonder what the name Wilbert comes from. Wilbert is a sort of a made-up name, if you like. Father had two favourite uncles, William and Herbert. So Wilbert is a combination of both those names. Father had a younger brother called George, and I believe there's a picture showing, first of all, family. That is a formal portrait. I think families often had these, didn't they? And this one shows this one shows us as a family. Hang on. Yeah, that's a formal one. This is one of us. This is one of us in a very cold holiday, and you can see the awful knitted blooming costumes. Some of you may have had experience of those, and I think we all look very cold there, smiling for the camera. This is showing father on the left and his brother George on the right. Railways very much in the family from the beginning. Father died in 1997, March 1997, and he inherited his love of steam trains from his father, Veer, a clergyman, born in 1854. Wilbert was the first child of Veer's third marriage, and that sounds dreadful, doesn't it? But this was a sad occasion because two of his first wives very sadly died, and so Lucy was Veer's third wife, and Veer was 57 when father was born. Father never felt his father was old because his father did all sorts of things that father did with children, so the age difference just didn't matter. But it also meant when Wilbert was only about 6, Veer was ready to retire from the parish of Ampfield in Hampshire, where he had been from 1895 until 1917. This was the vicarage in Ampfield, and this apparently is now on the gate, though there was no mention of Thomas in those days, but they've obviously found something that they want to put on it. Before Veer retired, however, he would be the one to take Wilbert on his afternoon walk on a Wednesday. His mother Lucy actually always liked to take the boys on a walk, and they were usually fairly educational kinds of walks. But the ones that he did with Veer were far more exciting. They would be more interesting, more hands-on, sailing paper boats on the stream, visiting the local smithy and watching the work going on there, or, joy of joys, down to the nearby railway track, where they would both stand and watch the steam trains or the plate layers at work. It must be said that the majority of Veer's parishioners would have worked on the GWR, so Veer had a lot of experience of railway work and railway men. If it rained when they were out for their walk, sometimes they would be invited to join the plate layers in their hut, full of odd, interesting objects and tools, and redolent of their strong tobacco. None of this would have been approved of by his mother, and I believe clean-up operations were often necessary on arrival home. When Veer retired, they went to live in Box in Wiltshire, and initially rented 2 different houses before ending up in this one, which was called Lawn House. It is still Lawn House today, but they called it Journey's End, which seemed very appropriate. This house now has a blue plaque on it, which was unveiled, I think it was in 2012, by my brother, Christopher. The main thing about this house was that it was very close to the GWR line and only 100 yards from the western end of famous Box Tunnel. Constructed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, as some of you will know if you were here yesterday evening and heard Mr. Brunel talking to you. It was constructed in 1841 for the GWR, and at the time of its construction, at 1 mile 7 furlongs, it was the longest railway tunnel in Britain. The line climbs here 2 miles at a gradient of 1 in 100. And trains don't like climbing So there was a tank engine kept in the shed at the bottom as a banker to help heavy trains up the incline. A young 8-year-old Wilbert would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds the engines made, and imagining they were talking to each other. A goods train would pick up a banker at the station to help push the heavy train up the incline. And the engine, struggling, would seem to be saying, "I can't do it, I can't do it." And the banker, also struggling and probably doing a great deal of the work, would be hissing, "Oh yes, you can, oh yes, you can." So, the stories of talking engines with personalities told to one small boy, my brother, probably have their origins in the experiences of another small boy and real steam engines, in whose fancy they all sounded different. As indeed they do. But you must note that they only talk to each other, their driver and fireman, never to the general public. So from this, how did it all begin? How did Thomas appear? How did the stories actually start? So we jump quite a long way to 1943, when my brother Christopher was 2.5, he had measles. I was going to say a more serious illness in those days, but actually it's on the rise again now, and it's still quite a serious thing to have. But then it could cause problems to the eyes, and so protection in a darkened room was necessary. Christopher was getting better, and consequently at 2.5 was restless and bored, and needed entertaining. Rhymes and tales soon lost their attraction, except for one particular one, still known today, and I think this was quoted yesterday as well, down at the station early in the morning. See the little engines all in a row. To make it more interesting for them both, Father illustrated the rhyme with round, head-on faces. That's the simplest way actually of drawing a locomotive, and gave them different expressions. One sad, one angry, one puzzled, one happy, and so on. And this is a very early sketch from Father. The sad one elicited the most attention, possibly because it best mirrored the small boy's feelings. And the story of Edward's day out evolved by question and answer. Why is he sad, Daddy? He hasn't been out for a long time. Why doesn't he go out? Because all the other engines are bigger and stronger and they get chosen first. What's his name? Edward, first name that came into mind. Now, as many of you know, as I'm sure you will have read to your own children and grandchildren, when retelling or telling or rereading stories to children, you have to be very careful with the choice of words, because they like to hear the same stories repeatedly with the same words, and woe betide you if you try and cut things short or change something. Children have a tendency to correct the reader if they dare to change things or leave something out. So Father, in self-defence, had to write down the stories. It being a period of wartime when paper was in short supply, he used the backs of parish circulars cut into small pieces, and we have seen some. I can remember him remarking once that this was by far the best way of treating parish circulars. And as a family, we have always used the backs of paper. And these pictures show the originals, the small pieces of paper, very, very tiny in fact, and with the actual writing, father's writing, and a few sketches too. So Edward was the first engine, but Gordon was then introduced in another story with Edward. He was a big, bossy engine, who eventually has to swallow his pride and ask Edward for help. A third story introduced Henry, who ended up being part bricked up in a tunnel because he didn't want the rain to spoil his new paint, so he wouldn't do his job. And this may have been inspired by a rhyme: once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain, went into a tunnel and squeaked through his funnel and never came out again. Apparently also, a locomotive in the United States came off the rails inside a tunnel. All the passengers on the train got out safely, but the tunnel was too low and narrow for the requisite machinery to lift the engine back onto the rails. It was more practical to block up the tunnel and construct another one, a larger one next to it. It must be noted, however, that this was not Henry's fate, as he could see over the wall everything happening around him. Have you got the picture of Henry? No. This was a picture from the original illustrator, Middleton, and that's Reginald Dolby's corrections and updates. But Henry carefully only has a low wall to look over. All the stories that Father wrote, and in fact my brother wrote, were based on real incidents, but happened to fictitious engines. They're accurate and authentic in railway law. All incidents are capable of a proper railway-like explanation. The only fiction is that steam engines have personality and can express it. Wilbert had infinite numbers of magazines, cuttings and driver stories for reference. And if anyone queried something as being strange, couldn't possibly happen, he knew exactly where to find the reference, magazine, book, or whatever, and could point this out that it had actually happened. It's a long way from little bits of paper, though, to actual publishing. This was during the war, 1943. Shortage of paper, but very few children's books around, which is very difficult to imagine today. Both my mother and my grandmother felt that these little tales were as good as anything available in the shops. And with their encouragement and a certain amount of pin sticking into my father, the precious scraps of paper were passed to a distant cousin, who in civilian life was a literary agent. The manuscripts were turned down by many publishers, in great part possibly because of the paper shortage. But they were eventually accepted by a man called Edmund Ward, a retired director of the Demantford Press in Leicester, who had decided to set up a publishing company of his own. He recognised that there was a dearth of children's books of good quality and with good illustrations, and was seeking manuscripts from new authors. He accepted the stories, provided that a fourth story was written, getting Henry out of the tunnel. And Henry, I think, is needed to help out, and that's how he comes out. So the two different artist pictures. I quite like the first one actually, where he's very grubby and has that lovely cobweb all over him. By now, this was the end of 1943, and the three railway engines was eventually published in May 1945, hence the 80th anniversary this year. Wilbert was genuinely surprised that anyone should be eager to purchase his stories, and as was usual then, Ward purchased the copyright for an outright fee rather than paying an advance and royalties. A lump sum of £21, 5 shillings, and £10, 14 and twopence for the final story. The format and size of the books with which you may be familiar was no doubt chosen at the time to save paper. But it's interesting to note that if you ever obtain any of the classic series, they're still the same child-friendly size and shape. Easy to carry, in a pocket, in a bag, don't take up much space. They did try another format in 1998, slightly larger, but it didn't take off. My brother often used to read in schools and libraries, and he always chose the old versions because the new ones, the pictures in them, didn't relate to the actual text. And the original ones, you had the text and the relevant picture was immediately opposite, so you had that reference. The book was a success and was reprinted 4 times between May 45 and March 46. 6 months after publication, Edmund Ward reported that the book was selling so fast he would like some more stories. One could say that this was because there was little choice, but the books continued to sell well on their own merit, even before there was anything on TV, which naturally brought them to a wider audience. So where does Thomas feature in all this? Well, he does appear, but he's not the first one. You could say that he was thought of in 1945, so he did come into being in 1945. He was inspired by this model engine, which father made for Christopher from bits and pieces. Had to be from bits and pieces. In those days, there wasn't much around. Christopher apparently had already a push-along Edward and coaches made by father, but it's always better to have another engine as well if you want to play. And so Christopher needed another one. Gordon and Henry were far too complicated to model accurately, so Wilbert made a small 6-wheeled 060 tank engine with materials currently available dictating the design. The boiler was a piece of broomstick, the chimney a metal tube, the dome a 2-pronged metal paper fastener, and wheels made from the flattened heads of drugget pins, apparently they used in carpet laying, and fastened with screws. This engine had to be given a name, and the alliterative title was Thomas, because it was a tank engine. He naturally had to have stories about himself too, and so this eventually led to Thomas the Tank Engine being accepted by Ward in 1945 and published in December 1946. Although not the first engine, he was the only engine initially to have a number. He was number 1. The model engine had a number 1 painted on it, but the simple reason for this was that number 1 was the easiest number to paint. NW at that point stood for Nowhere Railway, but I think it has become North West Railway. Thomas was the only one with a number until book number 6, Henry the Green Engine, when all the others were given numbers too. And any children will all know the numbers of the engines, even if the adults don't. The original model used to travel round with Christopher, but I believe, unfortunately, it was mislaid during one of his trips to the United States. But we do have photos, and replicas of sorts have been made. But you'll note he had 6 wheels I think my wooden one on there does have 6 wheels, so that's correct. So Thomas appears. I've been asked about different illustrators, and there were lots of different illustrators, which we'll come to. Sorry, I've missed out one bit. You've got those. Right, yes, sorry, I missed out one. The illustrators, they are an integral part of the books. And those of you who know the books quite well know there is a full-page illustration opposite every page of script. Father wasn't an expert artist, and he made no bones about that. But he knew exactly what was needed in order to illustrate accurately and according to proper railway practice. For instance, getting the signals right, getting the rails right, points and so on. There were some problems with an illustrator who saw no reason to be accurate. After all, he said, the books won't last very long. But children are very quick to spot discrepancies, and Father was forever at first having to invent stories to explain the differences in certain pictures. For instance, Henry had round buffers, and then in another book they were square, and then became round again. You can't just say to a child for whom it's all real, oh, the artist made a mistake. It spoils the magic. A small boy called Colin wrote, via his parents, to Wilbert in 1952 about this buffer business, and received, a few days later, a long letter story explaining away the discrepancies. As far as we in the family were concerned, I can well remember our anticipation and excitement when packets of the painted illustrations arrived at the vicarage for Father to examine and comment on. Overall, there were 6 different illustrators, the first being William Middleton. Here, if you have a first edition of the 3 railway engines, you will find the pictures like this, which are really quite strange. Rather strange looking engines with large moon faces. I can't quote exactly the price that anything has gone for recently, but it's quite high. The next artist was a man called Reginald Payne, and that is really the iconic picture of Thomas that everybody knows. There was no name written in the book to acknowledge the artist, and exhaustive searches to find the man or his descendants proved fruitless. The picture was improved upon by Reginald Dalby, who came after. He didn't alter the locomotive, just added more background and scenery. And this is Reginald Dalby, another Reginald. And this is an illustration from Troublesome Engines, I believe. And in this one, he put the family on the platform. So that's father and mother, and Christopher given blonde hair, me in the green dress, and Hilary with the pink dress on. The next one was John Kenny, who continues the same sort of style, but he unfortunately had to give up through ill health after a while. The next was a couple called Peter and Gunther Edwards, and this is a picture from them and portrays the locomotives on the Arlesdale Railway, which is in fact the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway, and shows the thin clergyman and the fat clergyman, the thin clergyman being Wilbert, and the fat clergyman his great friend Teddy Boston. And finally, Clive Spong, who illustrated all Christopher's books and did a special picture in 2011 for the Post Office Stamps yearbook. And we'd never met Clyde before, but he was up at the 5th Audrey extravaganza at the Talyllyn Railway in July, so it was really nice to meet the man behind many of the pictures. So, yes, that was a nice picture. A happy picture, you might say. We now come to the island and the map. As the stories and the characters increased, Father invented an island on which the engines worked and ran, complete with a full history and background, all fully documented. In this he was aided by his brother George, a librarian, and equally well versed in railway law. If you didn't know, the island of Sodor is located between Barrow-in-Furness on the mainland and the Isle of Man. It was invented, it's bigger than the Isle of Man, considerably. It was invented in 1950, after Wilbert had visited the Isle of Man to preach at a Sunday school festival. And later, in 1987, a book entitled The Island of Sodor was published. During his visit, Wilbert was intrigued to discover that the bishop had the title Sodor and Man, which he still has today, but in fact only had Man as his diocese. So the decision was made to discover another island and give back to the bishop the other half of his diocese. The name Sodor goes back a long way, and it comes from the term the Sudries, the ancient word for the islands to the west of Scotland. Those to the north were the Nordries. With the arrival of Christianity, the Isle of Man was chosen as a centre with a cathedral, and the bishop became of Sodor and Man. We don't know who the current bishop of Sodor and Man is, but we did meet the previous one, again, up at the Talyllyn Railway. And he was a railway fan, too. Father had a large contour map of the island, commissioned by Edmund Ward and made in 1951, which was always on the wall of his study, and is now in a similar position in the recreation of his study at the Talyllyn Railway Museum. I remember him using it to explain to me the significance of contours, which I found very difficult to understand when you're looking just at a flat picture. But this was all raised and lowered, and it made things much clearer. There have actually been several maps published over the years. The first being produced in 1958 as a folding canvas-backed map, as they then were. The whole was mapped very carefully as successive stories were written, so the island developed into a place having a reality of its own. That map was in 1958, and there followed some others, this one in 1971, 1983, and the last one, 1992. But you'll find actually that anthologies of some of the stories usually include a map, either at the front or the back. But it's rather a shame that no maps are published anymore. Father used to give 2 different lectures about the island, delivered most seriously, the railways of Sodor and pages from Sodor history. Apparently, they were delivered in a very serious tone, and lots of people actually believed that it was all true. Well, it was as far as their documented history of Sodor went, but people believed it was a real place. A bit like Tolkien, I suppose, and other things. We discovered details of these lectures along with slides in Father's effects. and these were passed over to the Tallaslyn Railway, where they were painstakingly sorted and scanned. Both these lectures were delivered in successive years at the Audrey Extravaganzas by no other than Tim Dunn in 2021 and 2022. Some of you may recognise him from the railway-based programmes that he's done, the architecture of railways and secrets of the London Underground. Delightful man, very keen on railways and very ebullient. Yeah, I was quite proud to have managed to get that with him before he dashed off somewhere else. In all of this, it's quite difficult to remember that writing stories was not Wilbert's first and foremost job. So parish priest and model maker. As Bishop John Yates of Gloucester put in his address at the memorial service for Wilbert in Gloucester Cathedral in 1997, he described him as a priest first and foremost, who never allowed his fame to impede his preaching of the gospel. Indeed, people have told me that he never mentioned his railway stories once in any of the sermons he preached, and I think that is absolutely true. This was a picture of a wedding taken in Emness, which was Father's last parish. People tend to forget this aspect of the famous author, a dedicated parish priest. Parish work always came first, and he put a great deal into anything he undertook. Thursdays, being nominally his day off, were set aside for writing, but any important parish business took priority. In 1946, we moved from Kings Norton in Birmingham, where Father had been a curate during the war years, to a very run-down parish in Cambridgeshire, and there was no time for writing. It was only under pressure from Redmond Ward in 1948 that he wrote again, and James the Red Engine was the third book in the series. He was never really happy with it, as he felt that it had been created in a hurry. Yet, oddly enough, it has been one of the most successful titles, and this is possibly because of the name, or because it's the only red engine. You notice he hasn't got a number on the side. The church that you saw was Holy Trinity, Ellsworth, which we have visited several times. In this particular parish, in Ellsworth, there were some brick-built outhouses in which Father was able to build, house and operate a model railway. His form of relaxation from the pressures of parish work, when one had to be, and still has to be, I believe, all things to all people. These buildings must have been icy cold in winter, and I can well remember my father's chilblained fingers. I think there's probably 2 black and white pictures of this was the actual model railway that was there in the outhouse. Quite complicated sets of rails and scenery. In 1964, Wilbert was quoted in the Evening Standard. Someone said, "Happy is the man who's got a world of his own." And it's true. With model railways, you've got your own private world, where you make things go the way you want them, without the frustrations of real life. We know of at least 2 other clerics for whom this worked too. The next parish was a place called Emness in Norfolk, where we moved in early 1953 to a rambling 3-storey Victorian vicarage with 3 attic rooms at the top. One, my sister and I had the playroom with dressing up box, books, toys, paper, etc. The other two, which were larger, then had appropriate holes cut in the dividing wall and became the site of a new extensive railway layout. Here the branch line really took shape, which helped with storylines in subsequent books. Quite a low roof up there because it was the top of the house, but not ideal for calling father down to the telephone, one telephone. So he rigged up a system of bells. I think sort of one ring meant telephone, two meant meal ready, and three meant something else. Later, in 1955, followed a small transportable layout. The that was Percy, the model, was on the previous. If you can just pick him out, maybe Percy is there, number 6. In 1955, followed a small transportable layout, the Farquhar Mark I, which could be taken to fetes and exhibitions. This, when folded and covered with a green baize cloth, looked remarkably like a coffin. And given that father always wore his dog collar, it's not too surprising that some hitchhikers declined and offered lifts. One did offer lifts in those days, but I think we're all a bit more hesitant about that now, but it was normal practice then. The Mark II Farquhar, slightly modified to fit into the railway room at the house in Stroud, where my parents retired in 1965. This one was built about 1966. There was also the mid-Sodor narrow gauge railway begun at this time at a scale of 4 millimetres to the foot, and this was used as an alternative to Farquhar. That one is in the care of Christopher's son, Richard Audrey. The Farquhar branch layout is displayed in the recreation of Wilbert's study, again at the Tulloch Lynn, and is taken by them to various exhibitions. The mid-Sodor layout is looked after by nephew Richard Audrey, and that has visited also the Tulloch Lynn Railway. Where did we come into this? Well, I suppose we were willing listeners to things that have been written, so I'll call it family testers. When we were younger, to us as a family, Wilbert was nothing special in the literary world. He was just our dad, with all that that entails. And the rest to us as children didn't seem important. It was only in later years that we really realised the extent to which we shared him with many other people. So what part did we play? News stories were usually tested out on us. Father would come to a meal with a script and read to us, as it was important to see how everything sounded out loud and see what our reaction would be, including my mother's. Often he was able to tell for himself if something did not sound right. If we did not approve, and he agreed, we would perhaps get the same story up to half a dozen times till it passed muster. The number of words per page was vital, only 80 to 90, which is actually very few. The choice of words too is important, and the text, technically accurate but brief, must carry the story along. Recently, we found out that the 5 important points that he used when writing: accuracy, consistency, choice of words, brevity, and fluidity. So that's quite a few things to concentrate on. Father didn't believe in talking down to children and used big words if he felt they were right and in context. And so Oliver, the Western engine, is described as having resource and sagacity. I think sagacity is a nice word to roll around your tongue even if you don't know precisely what it means at the time. But it also means that dear Percy amusingly had trouble reporting sometimes what he'd heard. Thus, diesel became diseasel, and coughs and sneezels spread diseasels. So, Father tried to bring in things like this to keep the poor adult who had to read these stories interested, if you like. So there were phrases that were common phrases that we use, but adapted to the railway system. That's one in the headline for can't stop, got to see a coach about a train. You'll laugh on the other side of your smoke box. Somebody got out of the shed by the wrong door this morning. There was much family input went into the story of the race between Bertie and Thomas, because we felt that the railway had the advantage. However, discussion and calculation of the number of hazards by road and rail, traffic lights, level crossings, as opposed to signals and station stops, showed that they were equally hampered. And this was proved by a sketch map drawn by Father, and the story went ahead. Although such a race as this sounds absolute lunacy in these days, I must reiterate that everything written by Father is based on fact, however far-fetched this may seem. Everything that's happened to one of his family of engines has happened, or in some cases could have happened, to an engine somewhere, sometime. And the same is true for Christopher's books, that is the classic series. Father moved with the times, introducing diesels, initially lazy and dismissive of steam, but later Boko and Daisy were good and hard-working. In 1972, Father decided to stop writing. He had no further ideas and would not, despite encouragement from the publishers, write anything he considered substandard. My brother Christopher, who'd always had a talent for writing, articles, poems, play scripts, etc., had written stories for his own son Richard, based on tales told him by railway men. Finally, his stories, true to the ethos of the railway series, were sent to the publishers with Father's blessing and encouragement. His number 1 book in 1983 became number 27 in the series, Really Useful Engines. And I haven't done a count recently, but I've a feeling that he wrote altogether 16 titles, and then the publishers didn't want to publish anymore. Egmont took over the publishing rights in 1998, and they didn't wish to publish any new books, content only to republish Wilbert's books. They decided to do the same with Christopher's at one point, and the final book in 2011, the centenary of Father's birth, called Thomas and His Friends, was published in 2011. So that is the final book. Notable dates. Fashions change, and over the years there have been all kinds of criticisms levelled at the series, as with many earlier children's authors. Edith Blyton, for instance, rolled down on them. But Thomas has weathered the storm on his own merits. Many words and phrases used by Wilbert have passed into common parlance, even if people are unaware of their origin. I've heard the term fat controller used on numerous occasions about people in charge, but note, he must now be called Sir Topham Hatt. And also, once in a former advert for cornflakes as the fat controller. Andrew Lloyd Webber's company is the Really Useful Company. And he is very familiar with the books, as is Pete Waterman. Thomas the Tank was a nickname given to a former Exeter Chiefs rugby player, and most recently a tank given to the Ukraine by the Czech Republic was given a face and named Thomas. Brian Sibley's biography of Wilbert was published in October in 1995 with a special event in London, followed by the naming at King's Cross of an East Coast electric locomotive, the Reverend W. Audrey, by Johnny Morris, along with suitable engine noises. Some of you may recall that Johnny Morris had read many of the stories originally on 45 RPM discs. Lovely man, really tiny in stature, but could just turn his hand or his voice to any kind of imitations of noises. December of that year brought Wilbert's inclusion as OBE in the New Year's Honours List for services to children's literature. Because he was practically bedbound with osteoporosis, the Lord Lieutenant of Gloucestershire came to the house to present it to him. And we, that's Christopher, Hilary and myself, were able to be there. It will look a bit younger. Considerably younger, yes, last century that one. Various stamp sets have been issued over the years. In 1998, 4 stamps with accompanying postcards were issued by the Talent Inn Railway, and in June 2011, the Post Office issued some sets of stamps and a medal to mark the centenary of Father's birth. In November 2020, some of you may have seen these or have them at home. They were very well done actually, and the Post Office did consult with us about them. It's almost too nice to use. November 2021, there was a special set of stamps issued by the Isle of Man. 2020 should have been a great year, with big events scheduled to celebrate the 75th anniversary. But a small thing called COVID intervened and everything was derailed. Parties had been planned, displays and so on, and Harrods had prepared a large window display with first editions of some of the books. Harrods did, however, produce some high-quality merchandise bearing the classic illustrations, which were on sale the following year. There are various memorials around. In 1987, at the Forest of Dean, Wilbert named an 060 Tungsten Tableside Wilbert. He was their current society president. And later, Wilbert, the locomotive, had a book written about him by Christopher. In September 2010, I and my sister Hilary were present at the rededication of the locomotive with a new nameplate to include Reverend W. Audrey, OBE. Now you'll all know this next bit. In 1998, a stained glass window, commissioned by Father in memory of my mother, was dedicated in St Mary Magdalene Church in Rodborough, Stroud. In the event, the dedication was after Father had died, so the window's also in his memory. But he had seen the plan and the coloured plan for his creation, and so he knew what it would look like. The window brings many people to the church to admire it, which it is a lovely thing, I think, and is a regular draw for Japanese groups, for whom Thomas is very special. He looks brilliant when the sun's shining through as well. In September 2004, a small memorial window was dedicated in St Edmund's Church in Emness, Father's last parish. They only wanted a very small thing, but that's quite fits the bill. Quite difficult to get a picture of it, actually. There are 2 various memorial plaques. In June 2011, I had the honour of unveiling a blue plaque on the wall of the old vicarage in Emness, which is they call the Old Vic, where Father was a vicar from 1953 to 1965. This was the idea of the then owner of the house, himself a model railway enthusiast by the name of Mark Thatcher, not the Mark Thatcher. In August 2012, a plaque was unveiled by my brother Christopher at Lawn House in Box. And in December 2021, one was unveiled on the rectory rooms in Ellsworth, Cambridgeshire, with a small attendance because some COVID restrictions were still in force. At the insistence of the couple who live in the old rectory, another was placed on the porch of their house. In October 2021, a beautiful slate plaque was installed in St Nicholas Church, Kings Norton, where Wilbert was curate from 1940 to 46. 3 generations of our family were able to be present. So that's very nice. Myself, Hillary's, my nephew Simon's sister Sarah, and the other sister Rachel, and her daughter Ruth. To sum up was quite difficult. I've often been asked in interviews what a father would think of how things have progressed. I can only reply, how can anyone second guess what somebody else might think? I can say though, it would give me immense pleasure to know that today, 80 years on, children and adults globally are still reached by and love the stories proved by events today. He was very aware that these stories have been the means of introducing countless children to steam engines and thus enjoying visits with their parents to our amazing heritage railways. It's quite possible that among some of these children, a few become active volunteers on these railways, which is very important to have the young ones coming up. Thomas unites the world in friendship is a phrase used, and father, essentially a peace-loving man, would be very glad. The name Thomas is internationally understood. I've heard children speaking a language I don't understand at all, and suddenly they say Thomas, and it's clear what they're talking about. It's a name that breaks down barriers. Robert Patterson, former Bishop of Sodor and Man, used to receive many letters from children, and it appears that any child who looked up the address Sodor was automatically given that of the bishop. Every letter was diplomatically and carefully replied to by his secretary, though anything addressed to the fat controller would take a little longer. The countries that have Thomas in some form or other: Japan, a lot, China, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Sweden, Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, South Korea, the Netherlands, the United States. And we have seen evidence too in Israel and Thailand, though the things in Thailand were a bit of a, if I can use the phrase, a knockoff, with no sort of pedigree. Very strange, but it's just lovely to feel that it is worldwide and still giving that pleasure. And also, Thomas is very important to people on the autistic spectrum. It's been proved that children can talk to through the engines. They won't necessarily talk to an adult, but they'll talk through the engines, possibly because it's non-threatening. I don't know exactly. But it's wonderful that formerly HIT were very supportive of the NAS, and now Mattel have been very supportive in a way of giving the proceeds of an auction recently to the National Autistic Society. So father knew that this sort of thing happened. He didn't quite understand why, but I think he was quite pleased to know that this was so. I I just realised I actually missed off something that's quite relevant. I should have said this at the beginning, but so I'll bring it in now. Very short quotation. It is a truth universally acknowledged that the clergy love trains. As surely as a newly appointed bishop will list one of his hobbies as hill walking, so you can wager that where there is a steam train, there among the throng will be an enthusiast in a clerical collar. And that, we've found out, is very true. So, there's a lot more one could say, but the seats are hard, and I think everybody's probably had enough, but I'm quite happy for anybody to ask me questions individually, so I hope you feel it's been worth your coming. It's been so lovely to be in this place, which meant so much to my parents.